Chuck Norris stepped out of the sleek black SUV with the quiet confidence of a man who'd fought wars on screen and in spirit. He adjusted the collar of his classic denim jacket, new, but tailored in the same unpretentious style that had made him a household name decades ago. Underneath, he wore a crisp navy shirt tucked neatly into his dark jeans, the top button unfastened, the look timeless in his eyes. His boots struck the polished marble of the red carpet with an assertive rhythm, yet the flashes of camera bulbs barely flickered. A few photographers glanced up. One even tilted his head, as if trying to place the familiar face, but none shouted his name. The buzz of the crowd flowed around him, oblivious. Inside the glittering walls of the Gala, a glass and gold structure perched atop Beverly Hills like a monument to ego, waiters carried trays of champagne and truffle canapes through a sea of couture gowns and silk pocket squares. The chandeliers above shimmered with unnatural perfection, mimicking stars that no longer belonged to the sky. Chuck was met at the entrance by a statuesque hostess with platinum blonde hair twisted like sculpture. Her gaze flicked to the guest list and lingered a second too long on his name. "Oh, Mr. Norris," she said, voice polished and empty. "Right this way." As she led him in, he caught her murmuring something to a man with a clipboard. They both glanced back and stifled a smirk. He pretended not to notice. The room was a buzzing hive of influence. Actors, moguls, politicians, tech royalty. But Chuck moved through it like a ghost in daylight. A few heads turned, and a few whispers floated behind manicured hands. Most didn't bother to hide their tone. Did someone invite their dad's action figure? "Look, it's the meme guy. Guess he found the wrong decade." Chuck approached the bar, requesting a club soda. The bartender, sharp in a designer vest with a discreet Bluetooth in his ear, poured without making eye contact. "You want lime with that?" he asked flatly. "No, thanks," Chuck said, nodding. He sipped it quietly as a group of 20-something influencers laughed behind him, one elbowing the other with an exaggerated whisper. "You think he's going to do the roundhouse? Like spin around and kick the air?" They burst out laughing, tossing their bleached hair and snapping more photos of themselves. A sleek young actor, currently starring in a streaming drama about dysfunctional billionaires, strolled over and gave Chuck a smile too wide to be sincere. "Man, I loved you in, what was it?" "Delta Team," he said. "Delta Force," Chuck corrected evenly. Right. Classic. Vintage stuff, like vinyl or typewriters." He walked away before Chuck could respond, already absorbed in a new conversation about a vegan yacht party. A designer from Paris, draped in silk like royalty, turned to his entourage and announced loud enough for Chuck to hear, "I thought he was a look-alike. There's no way the real Chuck Norris would wear denim in 2025. The group broke into mock applause, toasting imaginary cowboy hats in the air. Chuck found refuge near a marble statue, an abstract mess of bronze limbs that probably cost more than his truck. He folded his arms, his expression calm, unreadable. He'd taken beatings, lost friends, and been underestimated his entire life. But this was different. This wasn't a battle. It was exile. At the buffet table, he reached for a smoked salmon crostini when two women nearby commented, just loud enough, "Trying keto again, huh?" Either that, or he's bulking for another VHS sequel. They didn't laugh, they cackled. Chuck placed the crostini back without a word. The master of ceremonies took the stage, a flamboyant comedian famous for caustic roasts, sequins gleaming like a disco ball under the spotlight. With a mic in hand and a drink in the other, he addressed the crowd. "We are gathered tonight to celebrate power, elegance, and above all, relevance." Laughter rolled across the room like thunder. And yes, that includes even our guests from, what's the word, the Reagan administration? His eyes landed on Chuck. "You know who you are. Legend, meme, ghost of box offices past." Everyone laughed. Chuck didn't. He raised his glass, but no one clinked. He stood there alone, a monolith of a man surrounded by shadows and glitter. A teenage influencer strutted by, sunglasses still on indoors, brushing Chuck's shoulder without apology. A camera crew followed, documenting her every move. She didn't even acknowledge him. Someone spilled a drink nearby. The crimson liquid crept across the marble like blood from a silent wound. A woman pointed and said, "Oops. Don't worry, it's just Chuck Norris. He can mop it up with his beard." Chuck blinked slowly. His breathing was calm, but a storm brewed beneath it, one of humiliation he hadn't known since before fame. Later, a young billionaire in a white turtleneck approached him with a grin. "You're that joke guy, right? The internet kung fu Santa Claus." Chuck's jaw tightened. "I'm Chuck Norris," he said quietly. The kid chuckled. "Sure, and I'm Bruce Lee. See ya, Grandpa." Chuck turned and began walking toward the hallway, moving past the opulence, past the smiling avatars of what fame had become. He thought of leaving, of disappearing back into the mountains where no one mocked his age or his past. He passed a pair of actresses mid-laugh. "Even legends fade," one said. He didn't stop walking. But just then, murmurs began rising behind him, confused at first, then reverent. Someone whispered, "Wait, is that?" A hush fell across the Gala. The air changed, slightly, subtly, like the first gust before a thunderstorm. Then a voice, soft but firm, echoed from the entrance with calm charisma. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic on Rodeo Drive is murder." Heads turned. Phones rose like periscopes. There, under the archway, stood Richard Gere, and the tide of the night began to shift. Richard Gere didn't rush. He walked like someone who had never needed to hurry a day in his life. His silver hair was impeccably swept back, his tailored black suit carrying just the right amount of looseness to suggest comfort over vanity. The moment he stepped in, the room adjusted itself around him. Conversations paused, drinks hovered mid-air, and people pivoted unconsciously in his direction. He offered a wave, modest and warm, then scanned the room with a gaze so relaxed it bordered on amused detachment. His eyes found Chuck in the distance almost instantly. His expression didn't change, but he altered his course slightly, angling himself toward the hallway where Chuck had just disappeared. But the crowd surged to greet him. A pop star in a feathered cape squealed, "Richard," while someone from a Netflix political drama reached out to shake his hand. He obliged them with his usual grace, a slight bow here, a clasped handshake there, but his attention clearly remained elsewhere. The MC from earlier approached, eager to deliver one of his trademark barbs. "Richard Gere, ladies and gentlemen," the MC declared. "Proof that aging can be elegant, as long as your publicist works overtime." The audience chuckled. Gere smiled without warmth. "Thanks," he replied evenly. "And your proof that anyone can hold a microphone if they talk fast enough." The crowd laughed harder, not realizing until a beat later that he wasn't joking. The MC blinked and retreated with a tight grin. Richard moved through the glittering forest of synthetic charisma like a monk walking calmly through a marketplace. He greeted a few old friends, accepted a flute of champagne from a tray, then looked over his shoulder and said to no one in particular, "Has Chuck Norris already gone?" Someone nearby scoffed. "Yeah, he didn't seem to fit the vibe." Richard turned to the speaker, a fashion influencer in a rhinestone blazer, and looked at him as if seeing an insect that had spoken. "Funny," he said. "I thought he brought the only real dignity in the room." The influencer blinked. "Oh, what? Never mind," Richard said with a small shake of his head, and stepped past him. In the hallway, Chuck was standing near a potted ficus, hands in his pockets, eyes on the floor as though considering whether it was worth returning to the ballroom or disappearing into the night. "Funny place for a cowboy," Gere said gently. Chuck looked up, surprised. His face softened immediately. "Richard," he said, "didn't think I'd see you here." "Didn't think I'd see you walk out," Gere replied, stepping closer. Chuck exhaled, half a smile tugging at his lips. "You know what kind of night it's been?" Gere nodded. "I watched them tear you down with fake smiles and flammable confidence." He tilted his head. "That used to be my sport, remember?" Chuck shrugged. "Times change." "Yeah," Gere said, "but real things don't." There was a long pause between them, a silence only old souls could share. "You still hit harder than any man I've ever met," Gere said, nodding toward the ballroom. Maybe it's time they remembered. Chuck chuckled, low and quiet. "I'm not here to prove anything." "No," Gere agreed. "But I am." Without another word, He turned and headed back into the gala, this time not weaving through the crowd, but walking straight into its core like a knife through satin. The band was still playing. The influencers were still posing. But there was an edge of awareness now, a recognition that something in the room had shifted. Gere's presence wasn't loud, but it made others quieter. He walked to the stage without waiting for permission. The MC began to intercept him, but hesitated, realizing too late that you don't stop Richard Gere. You let him speak. Taking the mic, Gere didn't wait for applause. He didn't even smile. "I've been coming to events like this for 40 years, he said. "I've watched Hollywood change, bend, break, and sell itself over and over again. And I've seen a lot of legends pushed out the back door just because they stopped trending." A few awkward coughs in the audience. "I saw Chuck Norris walk into this room tonight," he continued, "and I watched most of you pretend not to see him. Or worse, saw you make a joke out of the man." He paused. "I get it. The denim, the boots, the legacy. It's easier to laugh than to look in a mirror." Now the silence became real. The crowd was frozen, some ashamed, others indignant, a few stunned into reverent silence. "But let me remind you of something," Gere said, voice rising slightly. "Before your trainers told you how to pose, before your agents bought your followers, Chuck Norris was real. He earned every callus, every scar, every fan. He didn't have CGI. He didn't have PR spins. He had grit. He let that sit. And some of you think that makes him outdated. I think that makes him untouchable." A slow, hesitant clap began at the back of the room. Then another, and another. Gere handed the mic back to the stunned MC and walked down from the stage. The applause built, tentative, then stronger, until it filled the room like a tide correcting itself. Chuck hadn't moved. He was still standing in the hallway, just out of sight. He'd heard every word, and he didn't need to re-enter. They came to him. First, a few actors slipped out, muttering apologies. One woman, trembling slightly, said, "I grew up watching you. I should have said that earlier." Another extended a hand, eyes lowered in shame. "You deserve better tonight." The rest followed like water breaking through a dam. One by one, they approached, the young, the powerful, the once dismissive, now scrambling to rewrite their reactions. Suddenly, everyone remembered that they loved Chuck Norris. They always had. Of course they had. Chuck accepted their words with grace. No gloating, no vengeance, just a firm nod, a rare smile, and the quiet strength of someone who had nothing to prove. Inside, the MC tried to recover with humor, but found the audience cold. The band resumed playing, but the mood had turned. It wasn't a gala anymore. It was a reckoning. Later, Chuck and Richard stood outside beneath the stars, the noise of the party muffled by glass and distance. "You didn't have to do that," Chuck said. "I know," Gere replied, "but I didn't like what they did to you." Chuck looked at him, something heavy lifting from his shoulders. "They're just kids. They don't know what it's like to fight for something real." Gere nodded. "They will." They stood together in silence for a long while. Two men who had seen empires rise and fall, who knew that relevance wasn't something you chased, but something you earned, sometimes in silence and sometimes in fire. The moon was high when Chuck Norris finally stepped back inside. He hadn't planned to return. The sting of humiliation still lingered somewhere beneath his ribs. But Richard's words had unlocked something, some truth that had been gathering dust behind the legend. He didn't walk in with fanfare. There were no flashing lights, no dramatic entrance. Just boots on marble, slow and steady, and a silence that settled over the ballroom the moment people noticed. It wasn't fear. It wasn't awe. It was something deeper, respect being reborn in real time. Conversations paused. Glasses stopped midair. People turned, not out of curiosity, but out of conscience. The man they'd mocked was walking toward them again, not to scold, not to fight, but to simply be seen. The band stopped playing. Chuck stepped forward under the same stage lights that had ignored him earlier. The MC, still reeling from Richard's earlier remarks, froze and slowly offered the microphone like a peace offering. Chuck took it, not smiling but not angry either. He stood there for a long moment, letting the silence speak. "I wasn't going to say anything tonight," he began, his voice low but clear. "I figured I'd come, shake a few hands, donate to the cause, and be on my way." A few nods rippled through the crowd. But then I saw how the room looked at me, like I was a joke that got old, a punchline that overstayed its welcome. He looked around, not accusing, just observing. He let the words land without force. And I get it. Time moves fast. New faces, new rules, new ways to be famous. He paused. Somewhere near the bar, a socialite set her glass down and folded her hands. "But let me tell you something. I didn't come here tonight to relive my past. I've lived it. I've buried friends. I've failed publicly. I've fought in places you've only seen through camera filters. And I've made peace with the kind of man I am." His eyes swept the room. No one dared speak. You think strength is about muscles or stunts or memes. But strength is waking up every day and doing what's right even when nobody claps. Strength is knowing who you are without needing to be reminded. Strength is walking into a room that doesn't want you and not shrinking. Someone exhaled sharply. A young actor near the front looked down at his feet. "You think relevance is what trends on Twitter? Relevance is raising your kids with values in a world that sells vanity. Relevance is showing up to a gala knowing you'll be mocked, but showing up anyway because it's for a cause bigger than your ego." A murmur of guilt flickered through the room like wind across grass. "I didn't become Chuck Norris because of roundhouse kicks," he said. "I became who I am because I never let anyone else tell me who that was." Now the room was still, reverent. Even the chandeliers seemed to hang differently, less like trophies, more like witnesses. Some of you know me from jokes. Some of you don't know me at all. That's okay. But after tonight, I hope you'll remember me as the man who showed up when it wasn't easy and didn't throw a punch because he didn't need to. He handed the mic back and stepped down from the platform. The applause was not immediate. It didn't explode. It grew, slow and solemn like a sunrise, as the crowd began to understand what had just happened. Not a speech, not a comeback, a quiet reclaiming of dignity in a place that had tried to strip it. A few people clapped through tears. Gere watched from the edge of the room, arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't move. He didn't need to. His job was done. People began to approach Chuck, not to flatter or apologize, but to listen. No more jokes. No more irony. The tech billionaire who had mocked him earlier offered a handshake with both hands and didn't let go for a long time. The pop star with the feathered cape removed her glasses, eyes wide and human, and said, "I've never felt so small and proud at the same time." Chuck simply nodded. The rest of the evening unfolded in a new rhythm. Not louder, but better. Conversations deepened. Laughter softened. The selfie stations remained, but fewer people used them. For the first time all night, people talked without performing. Later, the charity's organizer, a woman who had once said Chuck wasn't brand-friendly, found him near the balcony. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I judged you by your meme, not your meaning." Chuck chuckled. "You wouldn't be the first. Can we make this an annual invitation?" He smiled. "Only if there's pie." She laughed. "We'll make sure there is." As the night wound down, Chuck and Richard stood side by side again, this time outside near a fire pit on the rooftop terrace. "That was something," Richard said, sipping a neat bourbon. Chuck shrugged. "I just told the truth. That's exactly why it worked." The stars above were clear now, shining beyond the skyline, unbothered by who did or didn't trend. "You know," Richard said, "they'll tell this story for years. Probably turn it into an article, or a podcast, or a biopic." Chuck shook his head with a grin. "Let him. Just make sure they spell it right." They shared a quiet laugh. There was no need for more. Eventually, the crowd began to filter out. Limousines returned. Valets shuffled coats and keys. But the feeling lingered, like the aftershock of something real in a place that had forgotten how to host it. Chuck walked to his SUV, opened the door, and paused. A young man, one of the influencers from earlier, approached, clearly nervous. "Hey," he said. I know I was kind of jerk earlier. I just wanted to say, what you said up there, it meant something." Chuck looked at him for a beat, then offered a firm handshake. Then it was worth it. He got in, started the engine, and drove off into the Los Angeles night, quiet, steady, and whole.